welcome to Robert Jenrick to the Daily Tea, the Shadow Justice Secretary. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Telegraph's headquarters in London.
Very good to be back on the show.
Robert, could I just start off? Camilla and I were discussing before the break that if you go back over decades, prison policy, frankly, as far as the public are concerned, as far as many, many people in the sector are concerned, has been an abject failure. Given where we are now, what do you think should be happening?
Well, look, I think we do have to all be reflective about the state that we're in. I mean, our prisons are not working well. There are drugs, there is radicalization, there's poor quality rehabilitation and education. And so a lot needs to be done to improve the way in which we manage our prisons, without question. I think we also need to be building more prisons. I do believe that there is an important role for prison, not just as punishment, but for public protection. I think we should be using prisons to get dangerous people off our streets and give our communities breathing space. Now, in recent years, we have set out to build more prison places, and indeed we've added to them. The last Conservative government added more prison places than previous Labour governments in recent memory, but we need to go further. And what we've seen today from the Labour Party is the continuation of the existing prison building programme that the Conservative government was proposing. That will lead to, in total, 6 new prisons. 2 have already opened, 1 is about to open, and the others will flow in the years to come. And that's a decent start, but it is not enough. Because as the Justice Secretary herself has said today, there's going to be a big gap. We're going to have very soon a situation once again where we just do not have capacity. And I think the answer to that is on a number of levels. One is to build more. And I fully support efforts to make it easier to build prisons, because I think it's in the national interest. But I think we've also got to have our courts sitting for more hours. The most senior judge, Baroness Carr, the Lady Chief Justice, has said that there is capacity in the court system if only the government will allow her judges to sit more. And because they're not currently, that's one of the reasons why cases like rape and sexual assault are being pushed out to 2027 and 2028. And that's a disgrace. And imagine being a victim of one of those heinous crimes. And then we also have within our prisons today 10,500 foreign criminals. These are people who we need to get out of this country as quickly as possible. And I've said for a long time before I took on this role that we should use every lever of the British state to do that. That means things like saying we won't give foreign aid to a country if they won't take back their own criminals, or we won't keep granting visas to them. Use all of the power that we have as a state to ensure that we get those people out, free up capacity, and then use that capacity wisely to get dangerous people off the streets and out of harm's way for the public.
Won't attempts to deport foreign criminals back to where they came from just lead to very lengthy challenges by human rights lawyers? We've seen this before when it comes to deporting criminals in general. You know, it's a license for lawyers to just make more money, isn't it? This is the trouble. At every turn, you make these suggestions and there's a body of people to oppose them. We spoke earlier about the environmental lobby blocking prison building on the basis that there might be a couple of newts in a near vicinity, or what did you say? What was
Waterweed streams has blocked the building of prisons.
So you're talking tough, and it's good to hear, but in practice, these policies have never been able to be pulled off simply because there is so much legal challenge to anything you try and do to clamp down on some of these issues.
Yeah, well, look, Camilla, I'm the first to acknowledge that, aren't I? I mean, for a long time, and certainly over the course of the recent Conservative leadership contest, I've made the argument that our human rights apparatus is completely broken. It is from a different era, and it doesn't respond to the challenges we face today. And we need to change that. You know my view. I think we should leave the European Convention on Human Rights. The Conservative Party is now going to review in detail the treaties and conventions that we're a party to and consider what the right way forward is. Because you can't have a situation where there are dangerous people like rapists and murderers and indeed terrorists who we can't get out of our prisons because of these human rights laws. There are nonetheless things you could do today, even setting all of that to one side. You can sign more prisoner transfer agreements with other countries. I was involved in one with Albania, which is reasonably successful. They're not silver bullets, but reasonably successful. And I think you can also, not underestimate the strength that we have as a country when you're dealing with some other parties around the world. And we have been too weak in recent years to flex our muscles and to say to another country, look, if you want to have access to the UK for visas, if you want to have foreign aid, if you want to have the good diplomatic relations we have today, you can take back a murderer who is sat in our prison back to your own country. And I think far too often politicians, the Home Office, the Ministry of Justice, the British state has been too weak in responding to this challenge.
Do you try and have those arguments when in government? Because lots of people might say, well, it's good to hear, Robert Jenrick, that you have some solutions now in opposition. Why didn't you do these things when you were in government?
Well, I was never a justice minister, but I was a Home Office minister. And yes, absolutely. I mean, I argue, obviously, within government that we should set up a policy like Rwanda.
Is that genuinely that Whitehall simply blocking those types of policies ever being put in place? Or is it a lack of belief or strength from the politicians themselves? I think the public finds it maybe difficult to understand. If you're in government, surely you can pull the levers that you're demanding now should be pulled.
Well, I don't believe you should always just blame the civil service. At the end of the day, it falls to us as politicians, as leaders of the country, and it's a bad captain that always blames the crew. And so I do think that you want to have ministers who have the guts to make these tough decisions, to cut through all of the bullshit that you see within Westminster and Whitehall and actually get something done when it's so obviously in the national interest, like getting a rapist or a murderer or a terrorist out of this country. But there's also fiefdoms and interdepartmental battles where we say at the Home Office would say, of course we should get these illegal migrants back to Ethiopia. And then the foreigners would say, oh, but that might upset the Ethiopian government and we're trying to rebuild relations after some sort of spat that happened a few years ago. And that gets in the way of making the right calls sometimes. And then, of course, there is just this massive web of laws and treaties that we're a party to today that are built up year after year after year that make it harder to do these things, where you get utterly absurd decisions by judges who are relying on these conventions. I'll give you a recent example. There was a Ugandan man who beat up somebody, murdered somebody in the back of an ambulance in North London, was going to be deported to Uganda. And then the court said that Uganda couldn't guarantee his mental health under the ECHR, and so he got to stay in the UK. There are countless other examples. That's why we do need to look at our international obligations as well. But look, what I want to see this Labour government doing now is focusing on these sorts of things, not being defeatist and reaching for the easy lever in their eyes, which is just releasing dangerous people onto our streets. And I feel that perhaps for ideological reasons, Keir Starmer, Shabana Mahmood have been too quick to release those criminals back onto the streets as they did at the start of the summer. If I was Justice Secretary, I would not be releasing those criminals. Hell would freeze over before I would do that. I would be doing everything in my power to make sure that they were not out on the streets.
No, but and that is the tough talking that we would expect from you. Having said that, I think we can all agree around this table, quite happy for terrorists, killers and rapists to be behind bars for a considerable amount of time. There are some people, and Kamal spoke earlier about the sentencing guidelines, there has been a degree of disproportionality about the sentences doled out to people who have perhaps posted inappropriate comments on social media compared to people who have accidentally or not killed people in cars due to dangerous driving. So we've got kind of the public not really having faith in the sentencing system. We've then got some people, you have to admit, Robert Jenrick, in prison that probably aren't being benefited at all from being there. I made the point earlier that if recidivism in the country is at 75% within 9 years and 40% within the first 3 to 6 months, if that is the case, then prison isn't working for a lot of prisoners. So despite your tough rhetoric, there must be people in prison now that you would agree don't need to be there. They'd be better served doing community service, repenting in different ways, giving back to the public what they've taken.
Well, look, I don't disagree that I'm, like you, concerned about the way in which the police and the CPS are taking forward action against people on freedom of speech grounds, what somebody had been tweeting or saying in an article, that's quite wrong. I don't want to see people behind bars for that kind of thing. And I'm worried of what's going on in this country with respect to freedom of speech. But I don't agree with you if your argument is that we should be scrapping some of these shorter sentences, because I actually think it's very difficult to go to prison these days in this country. There are not many examples, if any. I would challenge you to come up with examples of where somebody has done a single theft, a single burglary, nicked a mobile phone and ended up in jail. That is not what's happening right now. In fact, since 2007, 50,000 people have escaped jail despite having 50 convictions per person. So you've got absolutely outrageous cases now where somebody has committed 100 thefts and has still not been sent to jail. And that is feeding into something which I'm very worried about right now, which is a growing sense of impunity for so-called minor crimes, the crimes that affect, frankly, everyone. We all know victims. You both may be victims yourself of having your mobile phone nicked, someone breaking into your car, your white van man, and your tools have been stolen overnight and you can't go to work. And people feel that these are almost being decriminalised. And so I am very sceptical of the argument, which I think is what the government is going to pursue in the months ahead with the sentencing review that they have initiated, this idea that people should not be going to jail for those things. Because I think jail for those people, yes, should be a place of rehabilitation, and that is often poor in our prisons today. But it's also about punishment, and it's about public protection. It is about giving communities breathing space by getting the relatively small number of career criminals off our streets, even just for a period of time. I don't know about where you live, but I represent a small town in North Nottinghamshire, and there's probably just a few dozen people who spoil that town with serious antisocial behaviour, with shoplifting, breaking into people's homes, drugs. And if we could get those people off our streets and into prison, if only just for 3 months, 6 months, a year, I think it would make a real difference.
That's the trouble.
Round them, if they do, round them up again and put them in prison.
Just to make the point, I think voters have heard. I think, Robert Jenrick, lots of our audience and voters will agree with you wholeheartedly. I literally remember speaking to Labour justice ministers between 1997 and 2010, to Conservative Home Office and justice ministers about exactly the same. This idea that very few criminals actually create and commit most crime, and we should get them off the streets. So again, where's the performance? Could I just ask you?
Come on, just on that point. Although this has been well known to politicians for decades, as you say, Michael Howard spoke about it in the early 90s when he was Home Secretary. It has not actually been pursued vigorously as a central policy within our criminal justice system. And in fact, today it is extremely hard to go to prison if you are one of these career criminals. You've got to work hard to get sent down. And so what I'm proposing is actually a different approach to the way we view sentencing. It is to say that public protection should be a central tenet of our criminal justice and sentencing system.
Multiple offences,
and if you commit,
have a higher chance of going to prison.
Exactly, exactly. And I think that's what the public would like to see, and that would be a big shift from where we've been in recent years.
Could I ask you just a couple of, towards the end of this chat, would you mind seeing the prison? Do you think the prison population is too high? And if it rose, would that bother you at all? We've had a situation in this country in 1991, 40,000 prisoners in the UK. Now 88,000 prisoners in the UK. In the same period, the levels of crime has actually fallen. Are you worried about the high level of people just actually in prison, or do you just think that's fine, we just go up and up and up?
I'm not concerned about that. They are high by international standards. We have one of the higher prison populations of comparable Western democratic countries. So we have to appreciate that, and sending people to prison is expensive. Today a prison cell is costing £600,000 to build, and between £60,000 and £100,000 to maintain every year. So, as a taxpayer, as someone a fiscal conservative, of course I should be concerned about these things. But I do think there is a role for prison, and I would be content for more people being sent to prison, because I think there is an opportunity here, if that's the right word, if we can get those career criminals, these hyper-prolific offenders, off our streets and into prison to further reduce crime. Because what we've seen in recent years is a general reduction in crime, But there has been a significant rise in some of these so-called minor crimes like theft, shoplifting, and I want to really bring those down. I think the route to doing that is to get the hyper-prolific offenders off our streets, out of harm's way for the general public.
Having said that, you have intervened in a debate this week on the idea of cousins marrying each other, right? First cousins marrying, and you're advocating this law to ban that. Presumably that could lead to the prospect of people that do marry their own first cousins, being penalised with prison? Would you advocate, for instance, somebody who broke that proposed legislation being put behind bars?
Well, yes, I think we should stamp it out, don't you? I think this is an absolutely abhorrent practice. The medical arguments are so clear. There is a significantly higher rate of birth defects if you marry your first cousin or your second cousin. I think there's a really important moral argument here. Hundreds of women are being forced into exploitative marriages in our country, ruining their lives. And there's a broader question about British values. This is not in keeping with our culture, and this is being predominantly brought into this country as a result of mass migration from some communities. You see it particularly in the British Pakistani community. This is a practice which, no doubt existed hundreds of years ago, but by and large had died out in this country, has reared its head again in recent years. And I think we've got to stamp it out. And if that requires a change in the law, then yes.
Bearing in mind everything we said about prison overcrowding, custodial sentences. Annabel Denham, our colleague on the comment desk at the Telegraph, made the point that I think it's around 39% of Pakistani families do intermarry. That's a cultural. It's a cultural thing that we might not agree with, but I just want to bring it back to this because this
Camilla,
is a practical question.
It should not. Well, there's a practical question. Sure, what
should
you do with the offenders.
Should we put people behind bars for marrying first cousins? You're actually saying that.
Yes, if that is necessary to stamp out this practice. There's a recent study that showed that in Bradford, 47% of British Pakistanis who were living there were marrying their first or their second cousins. I think that is absolutely.
But then you're putting a lot of people behind bars if you support that legislation.
I want to stamp it out.
But Robert Jenrick,
it never happens in this country.
You'll know that Bradford study actually revealed that number is coming down rapidly, particularly amongst British-born Muslims who are born
You're
here,
right.
And the numbers
the prior study had said it was 64%. It has fallen to 47%. So you're right.
Surely education,
but it's still almost half.
Discussion, yes, but as the generations change and British-born Muslims, that number will come down and down. It does seem odd to me. I agree. I think in the direction of travel you're going in, Camilla, that you want to criminalise something, put people behind bars at a time when we do have prison overcrowding, create a new offence for something that is working its way through cultural change, through just doing the things that you agree with, Robert Jenrick, which is people should become, how do we describe it, more British, where we don't tend to marry our first cousins, and that is actually happening. So,
it may be happening, but if it's happening slowly. I don't think any of us, and I would challenge you if you disagree with me, could justify the fact that in a community in Bradford, almost half of the population are marrying their first or their second cousin in 2024. That's not my country. That is a massive failure of integration and assimilation. Now, it may be improving, and if we were sat here in 20 years' time or 50 years' time, those numbers may have fallen back to the historic norm of virtually none. But I think that is very bad because you're going to see lives ruined, massive medical defects for children, hundreds of millions, not billions, wasted by taxpayers on the NHS trying to care for and support the people who are victims of these practices. Let's stamp this out once and for all.
Final question. Following the fall of Assad, Syrian prisons have been opened. We are now asking ourselves what might happen to Shamima Begum, the British schoolgirl that went out to Syria and associated herself with Islamic State. Should a prison space come available for Shamima Begum in this country?
No. If I was Justice Secretary, over my dead body would Shamima Begum step foot in the United Kingdom ever again. I do not want anyone who poses a risk to the British public coming to these shores, whether they have a claim to British nationality or not. We should be revoking citizenship and we should be refusing entry for these individuals. I'm very concerned about this. It's a much broader point than just Shamima Begum. there is a cohort of individuals, some of whom have claims to British nationality, who have been detained in camps in northeast Syria with the tacit support of Britain and other allied countries, supported by the Kurds. These are very dangerous people who have been associated with or actively participating in ISIS and their activities in Syria and Iraq in recent years. We have to ensure they do not come to this country. Now, I worry how Keir Starmer will respond to this, because Keir Starmer has a very rigid view of international law, and I worry that he will put that, as he has in other examples recently, like the Chagos Islands, above our own national interests. And when I was a minister in the meetings in which we were discussing these individuals previously, I was very clear, and frankly, every Conservative minister that I served with was very clear, we will not allow a single one of these individuals to come to the UK. And I'd like to hear that from the lips of Keir Starmer.
So you fear that Keir Starmer would allow Shamima Begum to come back to the UK?
Well, that is my worry. And he's spoken about it in the past. But it is a broader issue than just Shamima Begum, because there are other people who are in these camps in Syria who would like to come back to the UK. And there are human rights lawyers who argue that we have a legal and moral obligation to repatriate those people to our shores, irrespective of the danger they may pose to the British public. And we have to resist that, because we cannot risk the lives of British people by having these individuals, some of whom are frankly traitors, who have joined an organisation hell-bent on harming us and our allies, to come back and enjoy life in the UK.
Robert Jenrick, Shadow Justice Secretary, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.